Have you ever wondered where human civilization truly began? Not just the story of a kingdom or an empire, but the story of us, the moment humanity took its first steps from simple tribes to organized societies, from mud huts to cities, from myths whispered by firelight to written history carved in clay. Long before the pyramids rose in Egypt, or the philosophers of Greece asked their great questions, there was a land where humanity learned to build, to write, to rule, and to dream. This land was called Mesopotamia, meaning the land between two rivers. Those two rivers were the Tigris and the Euphrates, flowing through what is today Iraq, Syria, and parts of Iran and Kuwait. Between them stretched a vast fertile plain that gave birth to the first great civilization in human history. Around 3500 BCE, this region became home to the Sumerians, the world's first known urban people. Here, the story of civilization began, not with conquest or wealth, but with survival. The Tigris and Euphrates were both a gift and a danger. Each year, their floods brought fertile soil that allowed crops to grow in an otherwise harsh and arid land. But those same floods could be violent, unpredictable, and deadly. To survive, people learned to work together. They built canals to control the rivers, dug irrigation ditches, and created reservoirs to store water. This cooperation gave rise to something new, the first organized communities. Villages became towns, and towns became cities, and those cities became the beating heart of the ancient world. Imagine standing in southern Mesopotamia 5,000 years ago. The air is hot, the sky is painted gold by the setting sun, and in the distance, smoke rises from clay ovens. Farmers drive oxen through the fields, planting barley and wheat. Traders shout in the bustling market, exchanging goods from distant lands, copper from Anatolia, timber from Lebanon, and precious stones from Persia. In the center of the city, a massive stepped temple called a ziggurat rises toward the heavens. Its walls are made of sun-baked brick, each block carved and placed by hand. Priests climb its stairs to make offerings to the gods, seeking blessings for rain and harvest. This is the world's first city, Uruk, home to nearly 50,000 people, protected by great walls and ruled by powerful kings. Mesopotamia was not one single kingdom. It was a patchwork of independent city-states. Uruk, Lagash, Kish, and Eridu. Each had its own ruler, its own gods, and its own identity. Yet all were connected by shared beliefs, language, roots, and innovations that changed the course of history. The Sumerians were problem solvers and dreamers. They invented the world's first writing system, known as cuneiform. It began as simple pictographs, scratched onto wet clay tablets to keep track of grain, animals, and trade. But as time passed, writing evolved into a tool for expression. People began recording laws, prayers, myths, and poems. One of those early writings, the Epic of Gilgamesh, remains one of the oldest stories ever told, a tale of friendship, adventure, and the search for immortality. Before writing, everything humans knew lived only in memory. With cuneiform, knowledge became permanent. Humanity's first libraries were born here, in clay and stone. History itself began in Mesopotamia. The people of this land believed their world was ruled by powerful gods who controlled nature's every force. The sky god Anu, the storm god Enlil, the water god Enki, and the goddess Inanna, who represented love, war, and fertility. Life revolved around pleasing these gods through rituals, songs, and sacrifices. Temples were not just places of worship, they were centers of government, trade, and education. Priests held immense authority, managing everything from grain distribution to record-keeping. Religion shaped daily life. Every harvest, every flood, and every victory in battle was seen as a message from the gods. The Mesopotamians did not separate faith from daily affairs. It was part of their identity, woven into every action and every law. As cities grew, competition for resources also grew. The rivers that sustained life became lines of conflict. City fought against city for control of water and farmland. Armies marched across the plains, carrying spears, axes, and bronze weapons. Walls rose higher, rulers became more ambitious, and the idea of kingship evolved. Kings were seen as chosen by the gods to maintain order, justice, and prosperity. Through struggle and ambition, Mesopotamia became the birthplace of innovation. The wheel was first used here, likely for pottery, and later for transport. The plow transformed farming. The concept of time measured in 60 seconds and 60 minutes was invented here. Their mathematical and astronomical knowledge laid the foundation for future civilizations. Every discovery, every system, every idea that we take for granted today began as an experiment in Mesopotamia. The first maps, the first schools, the first courts of law, traces of a people determined to bring order to chaos. By around 2334 BCE, a man named Sargon rose to power in the city of Akkad. He conquered the surrounding Sumerian cities and formed the world's first empire, the Akkadian Empire. For the first time, Mesopotamia was united under one ruler. Trade expanded, cultures mixed, and the Sumerian language and traditions spread far beyond their homeland. Though the Akkadian Empire eventually fell, it left behind a legacy that shaped every empire to come. The idea that a ruler could govern distant lands, enforce laws, and maintain a unified culture began here. Mesopotamia's story is not one of perfection, but of progress. It's a story of people learning, failing, rebuilding, and advancing. Floods destroyed cities, yet they rebuilt them. Empires collapsed, yet others rose in their place. Through it all, knowledge and culture never died, they evolved. When we speak of Mesopotamia as the cradle of civilization, we are not simply honoring its ruins or its kings. We are recognizing it as the first place where humanity learned to live in complex societies, where we built cities, recorded ideas, and reached for the stars. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates did more than feed crops, it fed the human imagination. It taught us how to measure time, how to write, how to rule, and how to dream of eternity. This is where it all began, the cradle of civilization, where humanity took its first great leap forward. The world's first cities did not appear overnight. They were the result of centuries of adaptation, innovation, and survival in the challenging environment of Mesopotamia. As people learned to control the rivers and manage agriculture, their communities grew larger and more complex. What began as small farming villages gradually transformed into powerful urban centers, and with that transformation, human history took a dramatic turn. In southern Mesopotamia, around 4000 to 3500 BCE, a remarkable culture began to flourish, the Sumerians. They were among the first people to organize life on a scale that had never been seen before. While earlier societies had farms and small settlements, the Sumerians built the first city-states, independent urban centers surrounded by farmland, each with its own ruler, temple, and identity. Among these cities, Uruk and Eridu stood out as giants of the ancient world. They were places of innovation, faith, and ambition. Uruk, for example, may have been the largest city on Earth, around 3000 BCE, with as many as 50,000 people living within its walls. Massive structures of mud brick rose from the plains. Streets were filled with craftsmen, traders, and farmers bringing goods from the countryside. The city buzzed with the sound of life, progress, and purpose. At the heart of each city stood a ziggurat, a towering stepped temple dedicated to the city's patron god. These temples were not only religious centers but also political and economic hubs. They stored surplus grain, collected taxes in kind, and served as administrative offices. Around them, life revolved in a rhythm of work, worship, and trade. This organization of society required something new, a system to keep track of information. With growing populations and expanding trade, the spoken word was no longer enough. Memory could fail, records could be lost, and disputes could arise. The Sumerians needed a way to make information permanent. That need gave birth to one of humanity's greatest inventions, writing. Around 3200 BCE, Sumerian scribes began pressing small symbols into wet clay using a sharpened reed. These marks represented objects, numbers, and eventually, sounds. Over time, the system evolved into what we now call cuneiform, meaning wedge-shaped. Each symbol carried meaning, and together, they told stories, recorded laws, and preserved history. At first, writing served practical purposes. It was used for accounting, keeping track of grain, livestock, and trade. A farmer might deliver barley to the temple, and a scribe would mark the amount on a clay tablet, which was then dried and stored for reference. Each transaction became part of a permanent record, ensuring fairness and accountability. But writing soon became much more than bookkeeping. It opened a door to thought itself. Through cuneiform, people began recording myths, hymns, royal decrees, and even personal letters. For the first time, human voices could travel through time. Ideas could be shared across generations. Memory became history. The men and women who mastered this new art were known as scribes. In a world where few could read or write, scribes held great respect and power. They worked in temple schools, learning hundreds of symbols and their combinations. Their role was vital. Scribes were the keepers of knowledge, the recorders of trade, the authors of laws, and the voices of their kings. Without them, civilization could not function. As writing spread, it transformed every aspect of society. It allowed governments to organize resources, plan construction, collect taxes, and issue decrees. It made complex trade possible, as merchants could record contracts and inventories. It even helped shape religion, as prayers and rituals were written down and standardized across the cities. The Sumerian city-state was a living system. At its head was the NC, or city ruler, who governed with both political and spiritual authority. The ruler was seen as chosen by the gods to maintain order and ensure prosperity. Beneath him were priests, who managed temple lands and rituals, and administrators who kept records and oversaw workers. Farmers, builders, artisans, and traders formed the foundation of the economy. Everyone had a role in keeping the city alive. Trade was the lifeblood of Sumer. Mesopotamia lacked natural resources like timber, stone, and metals, so the Sumerians turned outward. They traded their surplus grain, textiles, and crafted goods for materials from neighboring regions: copper from Oman, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and cedarwood from Lebanon. The rivers became highways of commerce, connecting distant lands and cultures. Through trade, Sumerian influence spread across the ancient world. Ideas traveled along with goods. Writing, religious beliefs, art styles, and technologies. The foundations of international exchange were laid here, in the markets of Uruk and the harbors of Ur. But the growth of these cities also brought new challenges. As populations increased, so did competition for resources. City-states often fought over water rights, farmland, and trade routes. Armies were formed, and warfare became part of political life. Yet even through conflict, civilization advanced. Each war, each rebuilding, pushed innovation further: stronger walls, better weapons, improved administration. Amid this constant cycle of growth and struggle, the Sumerians created something remarkable: the idea of structured government. Power was no longer held by the strongest warrior alone. It was organized, recorded, and supported by systems: laws, councils, and written agreements. One of the earliest examples of written law comes from this period. Rules governing property, trade, and family life were inscribed on clay tablets to ensure fairness and consistency. These were the first steps toward legal systems that would later shape the world's great civilizations. By around 2900 BCE, Sumer had entered its golden age. Cities like Uruk and Nippur became centers of art, learning, and worship. Monumental architecture rose across the land, music and poetry flourished, and kings sought to immortalize their names in stone and story. The world had never seen anything like it before. Mesopotamia had moved beyond survival. It had created structure, beauty, and order, a pattern of life that would echo through every civilization to come. Writing turned thought into permanence. Cities turned chaos into community, and through both, the Sumerians gave humanity a gift that still shapes our world: the power to build, to record, and to remember. As the centuries passed, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates transformed into a network of thriving city-states. Each was like its own small world, surrounded by farmland and protected by thick mud brick walls. Within those walls, life was busy and full of purpose. The Sumerian cities of Uruk and Eridu stood as the jewels of early civilization. Each had its own identity, its own patron god, and its own ruler. Eridu, often considered the oldest city in the world, was believed to be founded by the gods themselves. In Sumerian myth, it was the first city ever created, a divine model for all that followed. Uruk, on the other hand, became a symbol of human ambition. It was a place of innovation, trade, and art. The city's great ziggurat, dedicated to Inanna, the goddess of love and war, dominated the skyline. Its massive walls, said to have been built by the legendary king Gilgamesh, enclosed markets, workshops, temples, and homes. In Uruk, civilization reached new heights. Ur grew wealthy from trade. Located near the Persian Gulf, it was a gateway to the wider world. Ships loaded with grain, wool, and pottery sailed downriver, while merchants returned with copper, gold, and exotic goods from distant lands. The people of yore lived with a sense of pride and prosperity, surrounded by the achievements of their culture, music, art, and architecture that reflected their faith and intelligence. But as these cities flourished, managing them became increasingly complex. Thousands of workers, farmers, and traders depended on organized systems to keep society functioning. Grain had to be stored and distributed, temple offerings recorded, and trade accounts kept accurate. At some point, the spoken word was no longer enough. Human memory could not carry the weight of a growing civilization, and from this challenge came one of humanity's most revolutionary inventions: writing. The earliest writing in Mesopotamia began as simple marks on clay tokens used to represent goods. A farmer might use one token for a sheep, another for a jar of oil. These tokens were stored in sealed clay envelopes as proof of transactions. Over time, people realized they could simply press the symbols directly into wet clay. Each mark carried meaning. Slowly, pictures became signs, and signs became symbols for sounds and ideas. This system evolved into cuneiform, the world's first known writing system. Scribes used a sharpened reed stylus to press wedge-shaped marks into soft clay tablets. Once dried in the sun, these tablets became permanent records, contracts, receipts, lists, and even stories. Cuneiform changed everything. It allowed information to be stored, laws to be enforced, and ideas to outlive their creators. Through writing, the Sumerians learned how to govern, how to plan, and how to remember. Scribes became the guardians of this new power. They were highly trained and deeply respected. In temple schools, known as edibas, young students spent years memorizing hundreds of signs and symbols. They practiced by copying lists of words, prayers, and stories until their hands knew every curve and stroke of the stylus. Becoming a scribe was a path to influence. Most people in Mesopotamia were illiterate, so scribes held control over communication and record-keeping. They were the link between the people, the temple, and the palace. Nothing official happened without a written record, and every written record passed through the hands of a scribe. The clay tablets they created reveal much about daily life. Some record business deals or tax payments. Others list workers and their wages. There are even letters, school exercises, and personal notes, small pieces of life preserved for thousands of years. In those lines of wedges and strokes, we can still hear their voices today. Writing also helped shape the first governments. As city-states grew, rulers realized that control depended not just on strength, but on order. The temples, led by priests, had once managed much of the city's wealth. But now kings began to emerge, men who claimed divine support to rule over both the spiritual and the political world. Each city had its own ruler, known as an ensi or lugao. They organized armies, led construction projects, and managed trade. But above all, they were responsible for maintaining harmony between the people and the gods. The prosperity of a city depended on divine favor, and every flood or drought was seen as a sign of the gods' judgment. To rule effectively, kings needed administration. That meant scribes, tax collectors, and record keepers, people who could measure harvests, record trade routes, and organize labor. Cuneiform became the foundation of government, ensuring that the growing complexity of city life didn't collapse into chaos. Trade connected every corner of Sumer. The Tigris and Euphrates acted like natural highways, carrying goods and people from one city to another. Caravans traveled overland to Persia, Anatolia, and the Levant, bringing back metals, wood, and stone resources Mesopotamia lacked. In return, Sumer exported textiles, pottery, and agricultural goods. The temples often acted as the central hubs of commerce. They stored goods, lent grain, and even organized trade expeditions. Religion and economy worked hand in hand. The wealth of a temple reflected the prosperity of the city, and the success of the city was seen as proof of divine favor. As trade expanded, so did cultural exchange. Sumerian merchants and travelers brought back new materials, technologies, and ideas. Over time, their writing system and innovations spread across Mesopotamia, influencing neighboring peoples such as the Akkadians and Elamites. The seeds of a shared human culture were being planted. By around 2900 BCE, Sumer was a land of bustling cities, each glowing under the desert sun, each striving to outshine the others. Life was rich but fragile. Floods could destroy crops. Wars could bring ruin. Yet even in uncertainty, the Sumerians kept building, inventing, and recording. Their cities stood as symbols of what humans could achieve together. Their writing preserved their voices for eternity. Their trade connected worlds that had never met before. And their systems of rule and record paved the way for everything that came after, from Babylon's laws to Egypt's temples. From Greece's philosophy to our modern cities today, Mesopotamia was not just the birthplace of cities and writing. It was the beginning of civilization as we know it. Every modern system, governance, economies, education, law, and communication can trace its roots back to these ancient city-states along the Tigris and Euphrates. The world had changed forever. Humanity had found its rhythm, its voice, and its purpose. From here, history would only grow louder. By the dawn of the 3rd millennium BCE, the land of Sumer had become a world unlike anything humanity had ever seen. Towering temples rose above sprawling cities. Farmers worked the fields with organized precision. Scribes recorded every harvest, trade, and prayer. And at the center of it all stood the Sumerians, the people who laid the foundation for civilization itself. Their lives revolved around faith. To the Sumerians, every act of nature, each storm, flood, or drought, was the will of the gods. They believed their deities controlled the universe, shaping destiny from the heavens. Every city was built around a great temple dedicated to its patron god. The people of Uruk worshipped Inanna, goddess of love and war. The citizens of Nippur honored Enlil, the god of air and storms. In Eridu, they prayed to Enki, the god of water and wisdom. The most visible symbols of this faith were the ziggurats, massive stepped towers that dominated the city's skyline. Built from millions of mud bricks, these structures were both temples and bridges between earth and heaven. At the top stood a shrine where priests made offerings, seeking favor from the gods. From the base to the summit, the ziggurat represented the link between humans and the divine, a staircase of devotion reaching toward the sky. But religion in Sumer was not just about worship. It was the backbone of society. Temples owned vast stretches of farmland, controlled trade, and managed workers. The priests acted as administrators, deciding when to plant, when to harvest, and how to distribute food. In time, these priestly leaders grew in power, combining spiritual authority with political control. They became priest-kings, known as Lugals, who ruled both in the name of the gods and for the good of their people. Under the guidance of these leaders, Sumer became a center of innovation. The Sumerians were problem solvers. They faced a harsh landscape, hot summers, limited rainfall, and unpredictable rivers, and turned those challenges into opportunities. To control the floods, they designed advanced irrigation systems, canals, levees, and reservoirs that directed water where it was needed. These systems supported large-scale farming, allowing cities to feed thousands of people year-round. From this abundance came progress. With food security established, Sumerians could focus on art, science, and technology. They invented the wheel, first used by potters, then adapted for carts and chariots. This changed transportation forever, making trade and travel faster and easier. Their mathematical system was equally revolutionary. Using a base 60 structure, they developed a method to measure time: 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, that still defines our lives today. They calculated areas of land, designed architectural plans, and tracked the movement of stars across the sky. Their interest in astronomy was not purely scientific. They believed the heavens reflected the will of the gods, and understanding the stars meant understanding divine intentions. Daily life in Sumer was organized, vibrant, and surprisingly familiar. Society was divided into clear classes. At the top were the priests, kings, and wealthy merchants who controlled trade and governance. Beneath them were skilled craftsmen, builders, and farmers, the backbone of the economy. The lowest ranks included laborers and slaves, many of whom worked for the temples or wealthy families. The Sumerians lived in houses made of sun-dried mud bricks, often arranged around central courtyards. Streets were narrow and winding, filled with the sounds of daily life: children playing, animals braying, and merchants calling out their goods. Markets sold everything from grain and fish to jewelry, pottery, and fine cloth. Families were deeply respected, and women played an important role in society. While men typically handled business and politics, women could own property, manage businesses, and even serve as priestesses. Marriage was considered sacred, and legal contracts, written in cuneiform, recorded agreements between families. Music and art filled their lives. Harps, flutes, and drums accompanied religious ceremonies and festivals. Artists decorated temples with intricate carvings and sculptures. Jewelry made of gold, silver, and precious stones reflected both beauty and devotion. Even ordinary objects, cliff seals, and tools were crafted with care and meaning. Yet, for all their progress, the Sumerians never saw themselves as masters of their world. They believed life was fragile, controlled by forces beyond their understanding. Their myths and stories reflected a deep awareness of human limits, and no story expressed that better than the Epic of Gilgamesh. Written on clay tablets more than 4,000 years ago, it is the world's oldest known epic poem. It tells the story of Gilgamesh, the legendary king of Uruk, 2/3 divine, 1/3 human, whose pride and power lead him on a journey that still speaks to us today. At first, Gilgamesh is a ruler obsessed with glory. He builds walls, conquers lands, and demands obedience. But when his friend Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh is overcome with grief. For the first time, he faces his own mortality. He sets out on a quest to find immortality, traveling through deserts, mountains, and the depths of the sea. In the end, he learns a profound truth that human life is fleeting, and that immortality lies not in living forever, but in the legacy we leave behind. The story of Gilgamesh reveals much about Sumerian belief. It speaks of gods who are powerful but unpredictable, of humans who struggle against fate, and of a desire to find meaning in a world filled with uncertainty. It reflects a civilization both advanced and deeply human, one that celebrated its achievements but never forgot the fragility of existence. Through their inventions, art, and literature, the Sumerians taught us how to build. Through their myths, they taught us how to reflect. Together, they created the first model of what it means to be a civilization, a society guided by faith, driven by knowledge, and aware of the mystery of life itself. As we look back on their world, the ziggurats rising above the plains, the stylus scratching symbols into clay, the merchants sailing down the rivers, we see not just the past, but the beginning of everything we call progress. The Sumerians did more than build cities. They built the foundations of humanity's shared story. To understand the greatness of the Sumerians, we have to step inside their cities, living, breathing worlds made of sun-baked clay, faith, and ambition. Each sunrise over the plains of Mesopotamia revealed a civilization both humble and extraordinary, a people striving to make sense of life through their gods, their inventions, and their stories. At the center of every Sumerian city stood a massive temple complex. These temples were more than places of worship, they were the beating heart of society. Around them, markets buzzed with trade, officials recorded taxes, and farmers delivered grain. But the true power lay within the sacred walls of the ziggurat. The ziggurat was no ordinary building. Its terraces climbed toward the heavens, each level smaller than the one below it, forming a grand staircase of stone and mud brick. From a distance, the structure shimmered in the sunlight, a physical connection between earth and sky. At its peak, the priests performed rituals, offered food and incense, and recited prayers to please the gods. To the Sumerians, these gods were everywhere, in the wind, the rivers, the soil, and the stars. Life itself depended on divine favor. A failed harvest or a violent flood was a sign of anger from above. That's why religion shaped every part of life, from politics to family to art. Each city had its patron deity. In Uruk, the people worshipped Inanna, goddess of love and war. In Nineveh, they revered Enlil, god of air. Eridu, one of the oldest cities, honored Enki, god of wisdom and water. The Sumerians didn't just pray for blessings, they believed the gods literally lived in their temples, and caring for them ensured harmony on earth. The priests were their messengers, interpreters of divine will. Over time, their role grew beyond spiritual guidance. They became managers of land, food, and trade. Because the temples owned much of the farmland, priests oversaw workers, collected grain, and distributed rations. Their records were written in cuneiform on clay tablets, an early form of accounting that kept the city running smoothly. As their influence expanded, some priestly leaders took on greater authority. They became priest kings, rulers who claimed both divine support and worldly power. These early kings united religion and politics, establishing the first organized governments in history. Their rule symbolized the idea that human order mirrored divine order. But even as religion shaped their beliefs, innovation shaped their survival. The Sumerians faced unpredictable floods from the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Rather than fear them, they studied their patterns, learned to control their flow, and built sophisticated irrigation systems. Canals carried water to fields far from the rivers, turning dry plains into fertile farmland. It was one of humanity's first great engineering achievements. This control over nature led to abundance, and abundance led to progress. With food security came time to think, create, and experiment. The Sumerians became inventors. They built potter's wheels, which inspired the creation of the wheel for transport. Wooden carts drawn by donkeys began to roll across the plains, revolutionizing trade and travel. They also developed one of the earliest forms of mathematics. Their system, based on the number 60, allowed them to measure time and space with remarkable precision. That's why, even today, an hour has 60 minutes, and a circle has 360 degrees. They used geometry to plan fields, design temples, and calculate rations. This mathematical logic became the foundation for science, engineering, and architecture across the ancient world. But civilization isn't built on technology alone, it's built on people. And the Sumerians created one of the first complex social structures. At the top were kings, priests, and nobles who controlled wealth and power. Below them were merchants, scribes, and craftsmen who kept the economy and culture alive. Farmers formed the largest class, toiling in the fields from dawn until dusk. At the very bottom were slaves, often prisoners of war, who worked for temples or wealthy households. Despite these divisions, every role mattered. The farmer's harvest fed the city. The scribe's writing preserved its memory. The builder's labor raised its monuments. Together, they formed a balanced but fragile system where cooperation meant survival. Sumerian cities were lively places. Narrow streets wound through neighborhoods filled with mud brick homes. Children played in courtyards while women baked bread or spun wool. Men gathered in markets, bartering goods from faraway lands, copper from Anatolia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and timber from the Levant. The Sumerians valued knowledge and education. Schools, known as tablet houses, trained young scribes to read and write cuneiform. These students spent long hours copying signs onto clay, learning thousands of symbols by heart. Literacy was a path to power and respect, a skill that connected humanity's first thinkers, accountants, and storytellers. Among all their achievements, perhaps the most timeless is their literature, especially the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's more than just a myth. It's the earliest human reflection on life, friendship, and mortality. In its verses, we see the heart of Sumerian thought, the belief that even kings are bound by fate. Gilgamesh, the mighty ruler of Uruk, seeks immortality after the death of his companion Enkidu. He battles monsters, crosses seas, and meets the immortal flood survivor Utnapishtim. Yet, in the end, he returns home realizing that no man can live forever. True immortality lies in what we build, not how long we live. The story captures a civilization's soul. It shows their understanding of loss, their longing for meaning, and their acceptance of human limits. In a world ruled by gods, the Sumerians found wisdom in humility. Their art and religion blended seamlessly with their values. The ziggurats reaching for the sky, the clay tablets filled with words, the careful irrigation canals snaking through fields, all were symbols of humanity as effort to bring order to chaos. As night fell over Sumer, oil lamps flickered in homes, priests offered prayers on temple terraces, and merchants tallied their trade in soft clay. The hum of civilization filled the warm Mesopotamian air. For the first time in human history, people lived not just to survive, but to build, remember, and dream. The Sumerians may have vanished thousands of years ago, but their legacy never faded. Every city, every invention, every written word traces a line back to them, to that moment in history when humans first looked around and realized, we can shape the world. From the dust of Sumer's great cities, a new power rose, one that would reshape Mesopotamia and change the idea of kingship forever. It was not just another city-state, it was the first empire in human history. Its name was Akkad, and its ruler was a man who began life as a servant, yet dreamed of uniting the world. His name was Sargon of Akkad. The story of Sargon begins not in a palace, but on the banks of a river. According to legend, he was born to a priestess who could not keep him. Placed in a basket and set adrift on the Euphrates, the infant was discovered by a gardener who raised him as his own. It sounds like myth, but like many great stories, it carries a truth beneath it, that Sargon was a man who rose from nothing. As he grew, Sargon became the cupbearer to the king of Kish, a trusted servant in a royal court. But ambition burned within him. He saw the disunity of the Sumerian cities, each ruled by its own king, each fighting the other. He understood that power did not lie in one city, but in the unity of many. Around 2334 BCE, Sargon seized his chance. He overthrew his master, gathered an army, and began a campaign that would forever change the political map of Mesopotamia. His armies swept across the plains with speed and discipline. City after city fell. Uruk, Gilgamesh, Oma, even mighty Kish could not stand against him. For the first time, all of Sumer came under one ruler. But Sargon didn't stop there. His conquests stretched beyond the boundaries of Sumer into what is now Syria, Anatolia, and the Persian Gulf. From the Mediterranean Sea to the Zagros Mountains, his authority reached farther than any before him. To hold this vast territory together, Sargon built a new kind of state, an empire. Its capital, Akkad, became a symbol of power and prosperity. Though its exact location has never been found, ancient records describe it as a magnificent city filled with wealth, art, and learning. Sargon knew that ruling by the sword was not enough. He needed loyalty, communication, and culture, so he spread the Akkadian language, making it the common tongue of administration and trade. Over time, Akkadian replaced Sumerian as the everyday language of the region, though the Sumerian tongue remained sacred in temples and learning. This blending of cultures became the hallmark of the Akkadian age. The empire didn't destroy Sumerian traditions, it absorbed them. The Akkadians worshipped the same gods but gave them new names and meanings. The god Enlil remained powerful, but new deities like Ishtar and Shamash rose in importance. The result was a fusion of belief and art that enriched both cultures. Under Sargon and his successors, trade flourished. The empire established routes that connected distant lands. Copper came from Oman, silver from Anatolia, and wood from the mountains of Lebanon. Grain and textiles from Mesopotamia were exchanged for luxury goods, precious stones, metals, and perfumes. The Akkadians didn't just build roads, they built relationships between worlds that had never before been linked. Administration became more sophisticated. Local governors were appointed to oversee provinces, collect taxes, and maintain order. Messengers carried tablets sealed with the royal emblem, ensuring that the king's word reached even the farthest corners of his realm. For the first time in history, an organized system of imperial government emerged, a model that future empires, from Babylon to Persia, would follow. Sargon's reign lasted for more than 50 years, and his legend grew with every victory. He called himself King of the Four Quarters of the World, a title that echoed his belief in universal rule. Yet, beneath the glory, cracks were beginning to form. When Sargon died, his sons and grandsons inherited a vast empire, but also its problems, the costs of constant warfare, the challenge of controlling faraway territories, and the resentment of conquered peoples all weighed heavily on Akkad's stability. Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin, tried to restore unity. He was a powerful and ambitious ruler, perhaps even greater in vision than Sargon himself. Naram-Sin expanded the empire further, leading successful campaigns in the mountains and deserts. He declared himself god of Akkad, becoming the first Mesopotamian ruler to claim divinity while alive. This act broke centuries of tradition. It was both revolutionary and controversial. For a time, it worked. Under Naram-Sin, the Akkadian Empire reached its peak. Art flourished, showing the king wearing a horned crown, the symbol of divine power. Trade expanded, cities prospered, and the empire seemed unstoppable. But fate, as the Sumerians believed, is never constant. After decades of prosperity, the empire began to crumble. The causes were many, and together they proved fatal. First came rebellions. Conquered cities, long resentful of Akkadian rule, rose in defiance. The empire's governors, far from the capital, often acted as independent kings. Maintaining control required endless campaigns that drained the treasury and weakened the army. Then came drought. For years, the rains failed. The once fertile farmlands turned to dust, crops withered, and famine spread. Recent evidence from ancient climate studies suggests that a severe megadrought struck Mesopotamia around 2200 BCE, lasting for decades. Rivers dried up, and the very lifeblood of the land disappeared. As hunger and unrest grew, external enemies closed in. From the north came a mysterious people known as the Gutians, mountain tribes from the Zagros region. They invaded Akkad, attacking its weakened cities. The empire, stretched to its limits, could not resist. One by one, the cities that Sargon had united fell into chaos. The great capital of Akkad, once shining with wealth and learning, vanished from history. Even its location was forgotten, swallowed by time and shifting sands. By around 2150 BCE, the first empire in history had collapsed. What remained were fragments, city-states once more independent, once more competing for survival. Yet, though the Akkadian Empire fell, its legacy endured. It proved that unity was possible, that cities and peoples could be bound under a single rule. The concept of empire born in Mesopotamia would echo across the ages, from Babylon and Assyria to Persia, Rome, and beyond. Sargon's name lived on for centuries. Later, kings called themselves sons of Sargon, hoping to capture his strength and destiny. His story, the orphan who rose to rule the world, became a symbol of ambition, courage, and the fragile balance between power and humility. In the end, the fall of Akkad was not just a tale of decline. It was a reminder of how every empire, no matter how mighty, depends on balance between ruler and people, between man and nature. When that balance breaks, even the greatest walls cannot stand. The dust of Akkad settled back into the earth, but the idea it created, the dream of unity and power, would shape human history forever. After the fall of the Akkadian Empire, centuries of turmoil followed. The once united Mesopotamian world splintered back into rival city-states. Empires rose and fell, but one name would rise above all others: Babylon. From a modest settlement on the banks of the Euphrates, Babylon would grow into the heart of a new era, a city whose influence would echo through history for thousands of years. At first, Babylon was just another small city among many. It gained little notice in the shadow of older powers like your Isin and Lhasa. But in the early 18th century BCE, a new ruler appeared, a man of vision, strategy, and determination. His name was Hammurabi. When Hammurabi ascended the throne around 1792 BCE, Babylon was far from a mighty empire. It was surrounded by stronger kingdoms and constantly threatened by wars and alliances that shifted like desert winds. But Hammurabi understood something few others did. Power was not only won on the battlefield, it was maintained through order, law, and the loyalty of the people. He began by strengthening Babylon internally. He improved the city's defenses, repaired canals, and encouraged agriculture. He promoted trade across Mesopotamia, using the rivers as arteries of commerce. Goods from distant lands began to fill Babylon's markets: gold and lapis lazuli from the east, timber from Lebanon, and spices from Arabia. Then, through careful diplomacy and decisive military action, Hammurabi began to expand. One by one, rival city-states fell under his rule. By the end of his reign, he had united nearly all of southern Mesopotamia, forming what we now call the Babylonian Empire. But Hammurabi's greatness did not lie only in conquest. His true legacy was law. In an age when kings ruled by decree and justice often depended on status or power, Hammurabi sought to create a system that would bring fairness and stability. He ordered his scribes to collect and carve into stone nearly 300 laws, a comprehensive code that covered every aspect of life. This monumental work became known as the Code of Hammurabi. The code was engraved on a tall black stone pillar of diorite, nearly 7 feet high, topped with an image of Hammurabi standing before Shamash, the sun god and god of justice. Shamash hands him a rod and ring, symbols of authority, as if to declare that Hammurabi's laws carried divine approval. The laws themselves were detailed and wide-ranging. They governed trade, property, marriage, labor, theft, assault, and even the wages of workers. The most famous principle was simple yet strict: an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. This idea, known as lex talionis, the law of retribution, meant that punishment should fit the crime. But the code was more than vengeance. It aimed to create balance and protection, especially for the weak. One law declared, if a man destroys the eye of another man, they shall destroy his eye. Another stated, if a builder constructs a house and it collapses, killing the owner, the builder shall be put to death. Harsh by modern standards, yet it reflected a belief in accountability, that no one, not even a craftsman or noble, was above responsibility. Hammurabi's laws also defended widows, orphans, and the poor, ensuring they had certain rights and protections. It was, in essence, humanity's first major step toward organized justice and governance. Public display of the law was just as important as the laws themselves. The stone stele was placed in a public square where all could see it, a visible reminder that justice was written, not whispered. This was revolutionary. In Hammurabi's Babylon, law was no longer hidden in the minds of rulers or priests. It was carved in stone, permanent and visible to all. Under Hammurabi, urban life in Babylon flourished. The city became a hub of learning, trade, and culture. Its wide avenues were lined with workshops, markets, and temples. The great ziggurat of Babylon stood as both a religious center and a symbol of power, reaching toward the heavens. Merchants played a vital role in the city's economy. Trade caravans came and went daily, carrying goods across deserts and mountains. Babylon's location between the Tigris and Euphrates made it a crossroads of civilizations. Its wealth attracted not only traders, but also scholars, artists, and priests. Education thrived in Babylon. The city's scribes were among the most skilled in Mesopotamia. In schools known as tablet houses, young boys learned to read and write cuneiform, mastering thousands of symbols on clay tablets. These scribes became the record keepers, mathematicians, and administrators who made the empire function. Mathematics and astronomy advanced as well. Babylonian scholars studied the stars and recorded celestial movements, laying the groundwork for future astronomy. They divided the year into 12 months and continued to refine the Sumerian system of 60-based numbers. Much of what we know about timekeeping today, the hour, the minute, still traces back to these early discoveries. Religion, as always, remained central. The Babylonians inherited the Sumerian gods, but organized them under a new hierarchy. Their chief god was Marduk, a powerful deity associated with order, justice, and creation. Under Hammurabi, Marduk rose to prominence as Babylon's patron god, symbolizing the unity of the empire. Temples to Marduk were grand and active centers of worship. Priests performed daily rituals, offered sacrifices, and managed temple estates. Festivals, especially the New Year's celebration, drew thousands of people who sang hymns, carried statues of the gods, and prayed for prosperity. But beyond faith and ceremony, Babylon was also a city of ideas. People debated moral questions, discussed law, and shared stories of gods and heroes. It was here that the ancient world first began to see law and morality as two sides of the same coin. Hammurabi's rule brought peace, order, and structure to a region long torn by conflict. Yet, like every empire before and after, Babylon's power would not last forever. After Hammurabi's death, his successors struggled to maintain control. Over time, new invaders from the north, the Hittites and Kassites, would challenge Babylonian dominance. Still, Hammurabi's vision outlived his empire. His code became a foundation for justice systems across the ancient world. Centuries later, kings, priests, and lawmakers would look back to Babylon and see in those carved stones the origins of their own authority. The idea that law should rule above men, that fairness should guide the strong and protect the weak, was born here, in the heart of Mesopotamia. As the sun set over the city's walls, its reflection danced on the Euphrates. Merchants closed their stalls, scribes set down their styluses, and priests lit evening fires in Marduk's temple. Life in Babylon continued, orderly and alive, bound together by the vision of a king who believed that justice was the highest form of power. Hammurabi may have been just one man among thousands of kings in history, but his laws carved in stone became something far greater, the enduring voice of civilization itself. As Babylon's glory began to fade, new powers rose in the north. In the rugged lands between the Tigris River and the mountains of Assyria, a different kind of kingdom emerged. One forged not in peace, but in war. These were the Assyrians, a people whose discipline, innovation, and ambition would shape the ancient world for centuries. They were both warriors and builders, feared by their enemies and admired by history. The heart of their land was Assur, a city perched on the western bank of the Tigris. It began as a modest trading outpost, but its people were resilient, surrounded by harsh terrain and rival tribes. They learned early that survival depended on strength, unity, and discipline. Over time, Assur grew from a city-state into the center of a powerful kingdom. By the early 2nd millennium BCE, the Assyrians had established a thriving trade network reaching as far as Anatolia and the Levant. Caravans carried textiles, metals, and precious stones across vast distances. Yet trade alone could not secure their future. To protect their roots and expand their reach, the Assyrians turned to the art of war, and they mastered it like no one before them. Centuries later, around 900 BCE, Assyria transformed from a small kingdom into one of history's most formidable empires. The city of Nineveh, on the banks of the Tigris, became its new jewel, a metropolis of palaces, temples, and wide boulevards. From Nineveh, kings like Ashurbanipal II, Tiglath-Pileser III, Sargon II, Sennacherib, and Ashurbanipal built an empire that stretched from Egypt to Persia. The Assyrians were pioneers in military innovation. They organized one of the world's first professional armies, trained, equipped, and paid by the state. Their soldiers marched in tight formations, used iron weapons, and employed advanced siege tactics. They built battering rams, siege towers, and mobile bridges to cross rivers and breach walls. Their chariots thundered across battlefields, while archers unleashed deadly volleys from behind shields. Assyrian warfare was ruthless but effective. Entire cities fell before their relentless campaigns. Those who resisted were often punished severely, deported, enslaved, or executed, serving as a warning to others. To modernize, their methods seem brutal, but to the Assyrians, they were tools of order and deterrence. Fear itself became a weapon. Through conquest, they built a vast empire from the mountains of Armenia to the deserts of Egypt. Roads and communication systems connected distant provinces. Messages written on clay tablets traveled swiftly between cities, carried by royal couriers. Governors, known as Zaknu, ruled provinces in the king's name, collecting tribute and maintaining peace. The Assyrians didn't just conquer, they administered. Their kings were not only warriors but also builders. Great cities rose across the empire, filled with towering palaces, massive walls, and intricate sculptures. Nimrod, Khorsabad, and Nineveh became centers of art, architecture, and power. King Ashurbanipal II built a grand palace at Nimrod, with vast halls decorated with stone reliefs showing scenes of battle, hunting, and ceremony. The figures carved into the walls, muscular soldiers, winged spirits, and divine creatures, reflected the Assyrian belief that strength was sacred. Every carving told a story of power and divine protection. Later, under Sennacherib, Nineveh reached its greatest splendor. The king expanded the city with wide avenues, temples, and a magnificent palace without rival, a sprawling complex of over 80 rooms. Sennacherib also oversaw the construction of one of the ancient world's most advanced irrigation systems, bringing water to Nineveh through aqueducts and canals that stretched for miles. But among all Assyria's achievements, one stands apart: the library of Ashurbanipal. Ashurbanipal, who ruled in the 7th century BCE, was not only a warrior king, but also a scholar. He could read and write cuneiform, a rare skill for rulers of his time. Obsessed with knowledge, he sent scribes throughout his empire to collect texts from temples and schools. They returned with thousands of clay tablets containing myths, laws, hymns, medical texts, and records of astronomy. By the time he died, Ashurbanipal had assembled over 30,000 tablets, creating the first systematically organized library in human history. Among its treasures was a copy of the Epic of Gilgamesh, preserved centuries after the fall of Sumer, proving that even the Assyrian warriors revered the wisdom of the past. Through art and literature, the Assyrians captured both the grandeur and the fragility of power. Their reliefs showed kings hunting lions, a symbol of dominance. Yet those same lions, fierce and untamed, represented the chaos that could always return. Despite their military might, the Assyrian Empire carried the seeds of its own downfall. Their harsh rule bred deep resentment among conquered peoples. Heavy taxes, forced labor, and mass deportations kept order for a time. But fear cannot hold an empire forever. Rebellions began to spread across the provinces. Enemies who once bowed now joined forces. The empire was stretched thin, fighting wars on too many fronts. Meanwhile, internal rivalries among Assyrian rulers weakened their unity. Nature, too, played its part. A series of droughts and famines strained resources and morale. Cities that had once overflowed with wealth began to suffer. In 612 BCE, the unthinkable happened. A coalition of Babylonians and Medes marched north and besieged Nineveh. After months of fighting, the mighty city fell. Flames consumed its palaces, and the Assyrian Empire, once the terror of the ancient world, was gone. The fall of Assyria shocked the ancient world. How could such a powerful empire vanish so completely? Yet history shows a pattern. When fear replaces loyalty, when cruelty overshadows justice, even the strongest kingdoms collapse from within. Still, the Assyrian legacy endures. They taught later empires the value of organization, infrastructure, and record-keeping. Their art and architecture influenced generations. Their libraries preserved the knowledge of earlier civilizations, ensuring that humanity's oldest stories would survive. Today, the ruins of Nineveh and Nimrod lie silent under the Mesopotamian sun, but their carvings still speak of power and pride, of wisdom and warning. The Assyrians remind us that strength can build a civilization, but only balance can sustain it. They were warriors and builders, creators of empire, guardians of knowledge, and witnesses to the timeless truth that every great power rises, shines, and one day must fall. When the Assyrians rose to dominance, they weren't just building an empire, they were defining what an empire could be. Their capital cities, their armies, and their achievements reflected a civilization that valued both order and awe. But behind that power, the same iron that forged their weapons would one day shatter their empire. Let's return to the cities that defined their greatness: Assur and Nineveh. Assur, their first capital, was more than a political center, it was sacred ground. The city took its name from their chief god, Ashur, who symbolized divine kingship and conquest. Every king who expanded the empire claimed to do so under Ashur's command. To them, empire building wasn't just ambition, it was divine duty. From Assur, armies marched outward, carrying not only weapons but a sense of destiny. Over time, as the Assyrian territories expanded, a new capital rose: Nineveh. Located further north, it became the empire's greatest city. When visitors approached Nineveh, they saw towering walls stretching for miles and massive gates decorated with stone reliefs of lions, bulls, and winged deities. Inside, palaces gleamed with polished stone, colorful frescoes, and sprawling courtyards. Nineveh wasn't only a city of warlords, it was a city of architects, artists, and administrators. The Assyrian kings were among the first to understand that power required organization. They built an advanced administrative system. Each province had a governor responsible for collecting taxes and maintaining order. Messages traveled through a network of roads and relay stations, allowing royal decrees to move across the empire with surprising speed. This communication network helped them rule efficiently, and also helped them keep watch on distant lands that might rebel. But it was the Assyrian army that truly defined their empire. It was the most professional fighting force the ancient world had ever seen. Soldiers trained year-round, divided into specialized units: infantry, cavalry, archers, engineers, and charioteers. They pioneered iron weaponry, which was stronger than the bronze used by their enemies. They developed advanced siege engines, towering battering rams, movable towers, and even early forms of scaling ladders. Their generals were master tacticians. They used psychological warfare long before the term existed, spreading fear through brutal punishments and public displays of conquered foes. Entire populations were deported from rebellious cities to prevent uprisings. It was harsh, but effective for a time. The mere mention of Assyria was enough to make other kingdoms surrender without a fight. Yet the Assyrians were more than warriors. They were also builders and creators. Their art and architecture reflected both their strength and their belief in divine power. Palaces were decorated with long stone panels carved in astonishing detail, processions of soldiers, scenes of battle, and images of the king hunting lions, a symbol of courage and kingship. These carvings weren't just decoration, they were storytelling in stone. They showed the world that the Assyrian king was chosen by the gods to rule. Among their most remarkable achievements stood Ashurbanipal's library, one of humanity's first great centers of knowledge. King Ashurbanipal, who ruled from 668 to 627 BCE, was unique among monarchs. He was not only a conqueror but also a scholar. He could read and write cuneiform, and he had an insatiable hunger for learning. He sent scribes across the empire to collect texts from every corner of Mesopotamia. They brought back thousands of clay tablets covering every field of knowledge: religion, medicine, law, astronomy, literature, and mathematics. Thanks to him, we still have one of the most important works in human history, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Without his library, that story, and much of Mesopotamian wisdom, might have vanished forever. Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh became a symbol of how far the Assyrians had come, from traders in a small city-state to rulers of the known world, preserving the culture of every people they conquered. But while their cities shone, dark clouds gathered on the horizon. The Assyrians' harsh rule and constant warfare drained their resources and provoked endless resentment. Conquered peoples hated their oppressors. Tribute demands grew unbearable, and the deportations that once ensured stability created deep anger in lands far and wide. One by one, subject nations began to rebel. The Babylonians, long resentful of Assyrian domination, rose up. They found allies in the Medes, a growing power from the east. Together, they waged war against the Assyrian heartland. Inside the empire, succession struggles weakened the royal line. Each new king inherited more enemies and fewer loyal soldiers. The empire, once held together by fear, began to crumble under its own weight. By 612 BCE, the unthinkable happened. The great city of Nineveh fell. The Babylonians and Medes stormed its walls, setting it ablaze. Flames consumed the palaces, the temples, and even Ashurbanipal's precious library. The empire that had once ruled from the Nile to the mountains of Iran was gone, erased in a matter of years. The fall of Assyria marked the end of an era, a warning written in ruins. Their strength had built an empire unmatched in scale, yet their cruelty had sown the seeds of destruction. Still, their influence never disappeared. The Assyrians left behind systems of governance, military strategy, and artistic expression that shaped later civilizations, from Babylon to Persia and beyond. They taught the ancient world how to build an empire, and how easily an empire could fall. The story of Assyria is one of brilliance and brutality, of unmatched achievement and inevitable collapse. They were conquerors who carved their legacy into stone, believing their glory would last forever. And in a way, it did. Even in ruins, the Assyrian spirit still speaks, a reminder that power without mercy is a fragile throne. When the mighty Assyrian Empire collapsed in fire and ruin, the lands of Mesopotamia entered a new age. Out of the ashes of Nineveh rose a familiar name, Babylon. Once humbled under Assyrian rule, Babylon was ready to reclaim its destiny. Under the leadership of one of history's most remarkable kings, Nebuchadnezzar II, the city would shine again as the beating heart of civilization, a symbol of power, culture, and divine splendor. The story of the Neo-Babylonian Empire begins in 626 BCE, when Nabopolassar, a Chaldean leader, declared independence from Assyria. His timing was perfect. The Assyrians were weakened, their enemies closing in, and Nabopolassar seized the moment. Together with his allies, the Medes, he struck at the Assyrian heartland. In 612 BCE, their combined forces destroyed Nineveh, ending centuries of Assyrian dominance. For the first time in generations, Babylon stood free, not as a conquered city, but as a rising power. Nabopolassar's victory laid the foundation for a new empire. But it was his son, Nebuchadnezzar II, who would turn Babylon into one of the greatest cities the world had ever seen. When Nebuchadnezzar came to the throne in 605 BCE, he was both a warrior and a visionary. His early reign was marked by military campaigns across the Near East. He defeated Egypt at the Battle of Carchemish, secured control over Syria and Palestine, and expanded Babylonian influence from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. The empire was strong, but Nebuchadnezzar wanted more than power. He wanted immortality through creation. He turned his focus to his capital, Babylon. What he built there would astonish the ancient world. Babylon had always been a city of great importance, but under Nebuchadnezzar it became a masterpiece, a city of stone, brick, and spirit. He launched a massive program of rebuilding and beautification. New temples rose to honor the gods, grand palaces shimmered with blue and gold, and towering walls surrounded the city, making it nearly impossible to conquer. At the heart of Babylon stood the Etemenanke ziggurat, a massive stepped tower dedicated to the god Marduk. Many believe this ziggurat inspired the later biblical tale of the Tower of Babel. It was said to reach toward the heavens, a symbol of human ambition and divine connection. The city's most famous structure, however, was the legendary Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Ancient writers described them as a series of lush terraces filled with exotic trees, flowers, and flowing water, a paradise in the middle of the desert. According to legend, Nebuchadnezzar built the gardens for his wife, Amatis of Media, who missed the green mountains of her homeland. The gardens were said to rise like a mountain of life, with water lifted by ingenious machinery from the Euphrates River to irrigate every level. Birds sang among palm trees, vines hung from balconies, and the scent of blossoms drifted through the warm air. Whether the gardens truly existed or were a romantic legend, they became one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, a symbol of Babylon's grandeur and the king's devotion. Beyond its beauty, Babylon was also a center of science, learning, and religion. The Babylonians were among the first to turn astronomy into a true science. They mapped the stars, tracked planetary movements, and used celestial patterns to predict seasons and events. Their observations laid the foundation for modern astronomy and even influenced Greek and Persian scholars centuries later. They developed a sophisticated calendar, dividing the year into months and the day into hours. They studied eclipses, comets, and the phases of the moon with incredible precision for their time. Their priests and astronomers worked in great temple observatories, called ziggurats, believing that the heavens revealed the will of the gods. Mathematics also flourished in Babylon. Using their basic number system, they performed advanced calculations, dividing circles into 360 degrees and hours into 60 minutes. Even today, our system of timekeeping traces back to these ancient scholars. Religion remained at the center of Babylonian life. The people believed the city itself was sacred, chosen by the gods as their earthly home. The main deity, Marduk, was worshipped as the protector of Babylon and the ruler of heaven and earth. During the New Year festival, his statue was carried through the city in grand processions, reaffirming the divine order and the king's authority. Nebuchadnezzar's reign brought peace, prosperity, and artistic revival. The famous Ishtar Gate, built in his honor, remains one of the most beautiful monuments of the ancient world. Constructed of deep blue glazed bricks and decorated with golden lions, dragons, and bulls, it symbolized the city's power and devotion to its gods. Passing through it was said to be like entering paradise. Inside the city, life thrived. Markets buzzed with merchants trading goods from faraway lands, spices from Arabia, wood from Lebanon, metals from Anatolia, and fine textiles from India. Scholars studied in temple schools, scribes recorded transactions on clay tablets, and artisans crafted jewelry, pottery, and statues that reflected the richness of Babylonian culture. But like all great empires, Babylon's golden age would not last forever. After decades of prosperity, the empire began to weaken following Nebuchadnezzar's death. In 562 BCE, his successors lacked his vision and strength. Internal unrest and corruption slowly eroded the kingdom's stability. In 539 BCE, a new power appeared on the horizon. The Persians, led by Cyrus the Great. When his army marched toward Babylon, the once mighty city offered little resistance. Without destruction or bloodshed, Cyrus entered Babylon and declared himself its ruler. The Neo-Babylonian Empire had fallen, but its legacy endured. Under Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon had not only reclaimed its former glory, but surpassed it. It became a symbol of human achievement, a fusion of art, architecture, religion, and science. The Blue Gates, towering ziggurats, and golden temples stood as proof of what a civilization could accomplish when guided by both faith and imagination. Even after its fall, Babylon's name lived on in scripture, legend, and memory as the shining city of Mesopotamia, the heart of human civilization. Beyond the wars, kings, and conquests, the real story of Mesopotamia lies in its people, the farmers who worked the land, the craftsmen who shaped clay into art, the priests who watched the skies, and the families who prayed to their gods for protection and harvest. Civilization was not built by rulers alone. It was born from the rhythm of everyday life, shaped by belief, tradition, and community. To understand Mesopotamia, we must walk through its streets, step into its temples, and listen to the voices of those who lived thousands of years ago. At the heart of their world was religion. The Mesopotamians believed that life was a partnership between humans and the gods. Every river, wind, and field had a divine spirit behind it. Their deities weren't distant, they were part of nature itself. The people saw their gods as powerful, unpredictable, and deeply involved in the fate of humankind. Among their most important gods was Enlil, the god of air and storms, ruler of the heavens and earth. He was seen as the giver of kingship and the one who decided destinies. Then there was Ishtar, known as Inanna in earlier Sumerian belief, the goddess of love, beauty, fertility, and war. She represented the contradictions of life, both nurturing and destructive. Her stories were filled with passion, jealousy, and strength, showing how deeply she reflected human emotions. And above all stood Marduk, the great god of Babylon. According to Babylonian myth, Marduk defeated the forces of chaos, creating order in the universe. In gratitude, the gods made him their king. His story, told in the Enuma Elish, became a central myth for the Babylonians, symbolizing how civilization triumphs over chaos. Religion touched every part of daily life. Every city had its main temple, known as a ziggurat, a massive multi-level tower that reached toward the heavens. The ziggurat was not only a place of worship, but a bridge between earth and the divine. At its top stood a shrine, where priests performed rituals and made offerings to the gods. Priests held great power in Mesopotamian society. They were not just religious leaders, but also astronomers, doctors, and administrators. They observed the stars to interpret divine messages, managed temple lands, and organized festivals that brought entire communities together. These festivals were among the most joyful and sacred events of the year. The New Year festival in Babylon, for example, lasted several days and celebrated the renewal of life and the victory of Marduk over chaos. Statues of the gods were carried through the city in grand processions, and people gathered to sing, dance, and offer sacrifices. The afterlife, however, was not seen as paradise. To the Mesopotamians, death led to a shadowy existence in the underworld, a dark, silent place where souls wandered, eating dust and drinking stale water. They believed that proper burial and offerings could ease the soul's journey, but eternal joy was not part of their vision. Their focus was on living a good life on earth and maintaining harmony with the gods. Daily life in Mesopotamia varied by class but shared common rhythms. Men typically worked as farmers, builders, traders, or soldiers, while women managed households, raised children, and in some cases, worked as weavers, brewers, or priestesses. In earlier Sumerian times, women could own property and run businesses, though over time, their rights diminished as societies became more hierarchical. Slavery existed, but it was not based on race or ethnicity. Most slaves were prisoners of war, criminals, or people who sold themselves to pay debts. Some slaves worked in households, others on farms or in temples. They could sometimes earn or buy their freedom, showing that even in the rigid social order of Mesopotamia, there was room for change. The backbone of society was farming. Mesopotamia's fertile land, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, provided abundant crops, wheat, barley, dates, and vegetables. Farmers developed complex irrigation systems, using canals and dikes to control the unpredictable floods. These systems required careful coordination, which helped create early forms of government and community organization. Trade was another pillar of life. Mesopotamians exchanged surplus grain and crafts for goods they lacked, such as timber from Lebanon, metals from Anatolia, and precious stones from Iran and India. Merchants traveled long distances in caravans, guided by stars and river routes. In bustling cities like your Uruk and Babylon, markets were filled with traders shouting prices and scribes recording transactions on clay tablets. Education also played an important role, especially for the sons of wealthy families. Boys attended tablet houses or schools run by scribes, where they learned to read and write cuneiform, the world's first written script. Writing was difficult. Each student practiced carving wedge-shaped symbols into wet clay with a stylus made of reed. Mistakes were punished with harsh discipline, but those who succeeded became scribes, respected professionals who served kings, merchants, and temples. Through writing, the Mesopotamians recorded everything: contracts, laws, hymns, poems, and even jokes. They preserved stories like the Epic of Gilgamesh, the earliest known work of literature, which explored friendship, heroism, and the search for immortality. In their words, we glimpse how timeless human emotions are: love, fear, ambition, and the longing for meaning. Art and music also filled Mesopotamian life. Sculptors carved scenes of gods, animals, and battles into stone reliefs. Musicians played harps, drums, and flutes during ceremonies and feasts. Even the simplest clay pots were decorated with care, showing that beauty mattered as much as function. In many ways, Mesopotamian culture was built on balance between gods and humans, nature and order, work and worship. Life was hard, often uncertain, yet deeply connected to the rhythms of the land and the will of the divine. Their achievements in writing, architecture, astronomy, and law weren't born from luxury, but from necessity. The unpredictable rivers, the scorching sun, and the constant threat of invasion forced them to innovate and organize. In doing so, they created patterns that would shape all later civilizations. When we look back at Mesopotamia today, we see more than ruins of ziggurats and faded tablets. We see the roots of our own world, the first schools, the first laws, the first written words, the first cities. The Mesopotamians taught humanity how to live together, how to record its stories, and how to seek meaning beyond survival. Their temples have crumbled, their empires have vanished, but their spirit endures in every book, every classroom, every civilization that came after. When we imagine ancient Mesopotamia, it's easy to think only of kings and wars, but behind those great names were millions of ordinary people, farmers tilling the soil, priests tending temple fires, children learning cuneiform on clay tablets, and families praying to their gods for health and protection. It was these daily lives and beliefs that gave Mesopotamia its soul. The religion of Mesopotamia shaped everything, from how cities were built to how people saw their place in the universe. The people believed that the gods had created humans for one purpose: to serve them. Every task, from plowing a field to building a temple, was an act of devotion. Among the countless deities worshipped, three stood at the heart of their faith: Enlil, Ishtar, and Marduk. Enlil was one of the oldest and most powerful gods. As the god of air, wind, and storms, he was both a giver of life and a bringer of destruction. He could bless the land with rain or strike it with drought. People feared and respected him, offering sacrifices to keep his temper calm. He was seen as the ultimate judge, the one who granted kings their authority and determined the fate of nations. Ishtar, the goddess of love, fertility, and war, was perhaps the most complex of all. Her stories showed both tenderness and fury. She could bring joy and abundance, but she could also unleash chaos when angered. The Mesopotamians saw in her the contradictions of life itself: beauty and violence, creation and destruction, love and loss. Festivals dedicated to her were filled with music, dancing, and celebration, as well as deep ritual mourning symbolizing her descent into the underworld and her triumphant return. Then came Marduk, the supreme god of Babylon. His rise reflected Babylon's own power. In the Babylonian creation story, Enuma Elish, Marduk battles the chaos goddess Tiamat, slays her, and uses her body to form the heavens and the earth. The myth symbolized the triumph of order over chaos, a theme deeply rooted in Mesopotamian life, where floods, famine, and war constantly threatened stability. Under Marduk's rule, Babylon became the city of the gods, and its king ruled as his earthly representative. These beliefs were not just stories. They were woven into the very structure of Mesopotamian cities. The most striking example of this was the ziggurat, a towering stepped temple made of sun-dried brick. Each level symbolized a different realm, rising from the earth toward the heavens. At the top stood a small shrine where priests performed rituals to honor the gods. To the people below, the ziggurat was a physical bridge between the human world and the divine. Religion was not confined to temples. It lived in every home. Families kept small statues of gods and spirits on household altars, offering bread, beer, and one of the most important aspects of Mesopotamian religion was the afterlife. Unlike later civilizations that imagined paradise, the Mesopotamians believed in a shadowy underworld. Souls went to a dark, dusty place called the Land of No Return, ruled by the goddess Eridu. There was no reward or punishment, only endless existence. To ease this fate, families made offerings for their ancestors, believing it gave the dead some comfort in the afterlife. Life on earth, therefore, was everything. It was to be lived with respect for the gods, for family, and for the natural order. The structure of Mesopotamian society reflected this belief in order. Men, especially of the upper classes, were heads of families and main providers. They worked as farmers, merchants, scribes, and officials. Women managed households, raised children, and prepared food, but their roles could vary. Some women served as priestesses or owned businesses, particularly in early Sumerian times. They brewed beer, wove textiles, and traded in local markets. While their status declined in later periods, their presence remained vital to family and economic life. At the bottom of society were slaves. Most were prisoners of war or people who had fallen into debt. Slavery in Mesopotamia, however, wasn't always permanent. Some could buy their freedom or earn it through loyal service. Even within slavery, there were distinctions. Household slaves often lived better lives than those forced to work on farms or construction projects. The economy of Mesopotamia revolved around agriculture. The twin rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, were both a blessing and a challenge. Their floods brought rich soil but could also destroy crops if mistimed. To survive, farmers built intricate irrigation systems, channeling water through canals and dikes. This cooperation required planning, leadership, and labor, the building blocks of civilization itself. Farmers grew barley, wheat, onions, dates, and lentils, and raised cattle, sheep, and goats. The produce supported not just families but the temple economy. Temples owned large tracts of land and stored grain to distribute during famine, making them centers of both religion and welfare. Trade also flourished. Because Mesopotamia lacked natural resources like wood and metals, merchants traveled far to Anatolia for tin, Lebanon for cedar, and Persia for precious stones. Caravans and riverboats carried goods along routes that connected Mesopotamia to Egypt, India, and the Mediterranean. Babylon, in particular, became a crossroads of the ancient world, filled with markets bustling with goods, languages, and ideas. Education held special importance, especially for the sons of the wealthy. Schools known as tablet houses trained young boys to become scribes, an honored profession. Learning cuneiform was difficult and time-consuming. Students practiced by inscribing signs onto clay tablets using reed styluses, often repeating the same line hundreds of times. Discipline was strict, but success brought prestige. Scribes were essential to every part of Mesopotamian life, recording trade, writing laws, and preserving literature. In the evenings, the cities came alive with social life. Families gathered to share meals, storytellers entertained with myths and songs, and musicians played harps, drums, and flutes during festivals. Temples hosted community feasts where people celebrated births, harvests, and victories. Life was simple but filled with meaning, guided by tradition and faith. What makes Mesopotamia remarkable is how human it feels even across the distance of 5,000 years. Their struggles to control nature, to understand the divine, to build a stable society, are the same questions humanity still faces today. They built systems of law, education, and religion, not just to survive but to give life structure and purpose. In their temples, they sought connection. In their farms, they built communities. In their writing, they captured the first expressions of human thought. Mesopotamia's greatness wasn't only in its kings or empires. It was in its people, whose daily lives formed the foundation of civilization itself. Even now, when we speak of time, measure the stars, or write on a tablet, whether digital or clay, we are echoing the legacy of those who once walked along the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates. The story of Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, does not end with glory. Like all great civilizations, it eventually faced decline, not from a single catastrophe, but from centuries of conquest, cultural change, and slow transformation. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates, once the beating heart of human progress, became a crossroads of empires. Yet even in decline, its legacy endured, shaping the very foundations of the world that came after it. By the late 7th century BCE, the once mighty Assyrian Empire had fallen. The Neo-Babylonian Empire briefly revived the splendor of Mesopotamia under King Nebuchadnezzar II, rebuilding Babylon and making it the pride of the ancient world. But beneath the surface, change was coming. Far to the east, a new power was rising, the Persian Empire under the visionary leadership of Cyrus the Great. Cyrus was not a conqueror driven by destruction. He was a strategist and a unifier. Around 539 BCE, his armies marched westward and captured Babylon without significant bloodshed. Ancient accounts tell of the city's gates being opened by its own priests and citizens, who welcomed Cyrus as a liberator. The Persians were skilled diplomats as much as warriors, and Cyrus's rule marked the beginning of a new chapter in Mesopotamia's long history. Under Persian control, Mesopotamia became a province within a vast empire that stretched from India to Egypt. The Persians brought stability and order, allowing local traditions to continue. Cyrus respected the religions and customs of the peoples he conquered, a policy that earned him loyalty rather than rebellion. In Babylon, he even participated in temple rituals to honor Marduk, showing reverence for the city's ancient faith. But despite this tolerance, true independence was gone. The kings of Babylon no longer ruled as divine representatives. They served under the authority of a foreign emperor. The temples, once centers of political power, lost their influence. Administrative languages began to shift from Akkadian and Sumerian to Aramaic, the new common tongue of the Persian Empire. Over generations, the old Mesopotamian languages faded from daily use, surviving only in temple texts and scholarly records. This gradual cultural blending reshaped Mesopotamian society. Persian art, law, and administration merged with Babylonian traditions. Local gods were still worshipped, but their importance slowly declined as new religious ideas spread across the region. The ziggurats remained, but fewer offerings filled their altars. Festivals that once celebrated Ishtar, Enlil, and Marduk grew quieter with each passing century. The Persian Empire's system of roads and communication transformed Mesopotamia into a vital link between East and West. Trade flourished again, but the region's identity was no longer purely its own. The cities of Ur, Uruk, and Nippur became shadows of their former selves, historical relics admired but no longer central to power or innovation. Then, in 331 BCE, another conqueror arrived, Alexander the Great. After defeating the Persians, Alexander entered Babylon in triumph. The ancient city welcomed him, and for a moment, it seemed as if Mesopotamia might rise again. Alexander planned to make Babylon the capital of his vast empire, even ordering restoration work on its temples and palaces. But his death in 323 BCE ended those dreams. His generals divided the empire, and Babylon's glory once more began to fade. Over the next centuries, Hellenistic Greek influence spread through the region, bringing new art, language, and philosophy. The old cuneiform script, the symbol of Mesopotamian wisdom, fell out of use completely. By the 1st century CE, the knowledge it held, written on thousands of clay tablets, was buried under sand and forgotten. Yet Mesopotamia did not truly vanish. Its legacy lived on, absorbed by the civilizations that followed. The Persians preserved its administrative systems. The Greeks learned from its astronomy and mathematics. The Romans inherited its ideas of law and governance. And perhaps most importantly, its religious and mythological ideas echoed in the great faiths that emerged later. The concept of a flood sent by the gods, found in the Epic of Gilgamesh, appears in the stories of Noah, in the Bible, and Utnapishtim in earlier Sumerian myths. The image of a divine paradise resembling the gardens of Mesopotamian temples found its way into later visions of heaven. Even the Tower of Babel, one of the most famous stories in the Book of Genesis, is believed to have been inspired by the towering ziggurats of Babylon. Mesopotamia's spirit also endured in the sciences and arts. Their system of writing inspired others. Their calendars and astronomical observations influenced future generations. The 60-minute hour and 360-degree circle, first calculated in Sumer, are still used today, silent reminders of their brilliance. By the time of the Parthians and Romans, Mesopotamia was no longer the center of the world, but a province among many. Empires rose and fell around it. The Persians again, the Greeks, the Arabs, each leaving its mark. The once mighty cities turned to ruins, their bricks taken by later builders, their names surviving only in legend. But the memory of Mesopotamia was never truly lost. In the 19th century, archaeologists unearthed the remains of Uruk, Nineveh, and Babylon, along with thousands of clay tablets covered in mysterious wedge-shaped writing. When scholars finally deciphered cuneiform, the voices of the world's first writers spoke again after being silent for 2 millennia. Through those texts, we discovered not just kings and wars, but poems, prayers, business records, and letters, proof that Mesopotamia was more than an ancient power. It was a civilization of thinkers, dreamers, and creators who laid the first stones of human progress. In the end, Mesopotamia did not die. It evolved, transformed, and lived on in every culture that followed. Its rivers no longer ruled empires, but its ideas continued to flow through religion, science, and the very fabric of civilization itself. When we speak of justice, law, writing, and wisdom, we are still speaking the language of Mesopotamia. The land between two rivers gave birth to humanity's first great experiment, the building of a world that could think, record, and remember. And even though its empires fell, that dream never did. The final centuries of Mesopotamia were a quiet twilight, a time when old traditions met new empires, and the once mighty cities of Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon began to fade into memory. Yet this decline wasn't sudden or violent. It was gradual, the slow merging of ancient ways with the rhythms of new rulers and cultures that came to dominate the region. When Cyrus the Great of Persia marched into Babylon in 539 BCE, it marked the end of Mesopotamian independence. The Babylonians, weary from years of internal conflict and ineffective leadership, did not resist. Ancient sources describe the Persians entering the city peacefully, with Cyrus greeted not as a conqueror but as a liberator. He respected Babylon's long religious traditions, visited its temples, and even participated in ceremonies to honor Marduk, the city's chief god. Cyrus's rule brought stability. He allowed local religions and customs to continue, and his administration maintained much of Babylon's political structure. The priests, scribes, and merchants continued their work, and the temples still burned incense to the gods. Yet, beneath the surface, the foundations of Mesopotamian civilization were shifting. Under the Achaemenid Persian Empire, Mesopotamia became just one province among many, no longer the heart of civilization, but a valuable part of a much larger world. Persian satraps or governors ruled the region on behalf of the king. The grand palaces of Susa and Persepolis became centers of power, not Babylon or Ur. The language of government slowly changed from Akkadian to Aramaic, a simpler tongue that spread across the empire. This was the beginning of the end for Mesopotamia's ancient languages and writing systems. The use of cuneiform began to decline. Scribes still taught it in temple schools, but fewer people learned to read it. Over the centuries, it became a language of scholars and priests, not of daily life. By the 1st century CE, it had vanished completely, buried beneath layers of history. The people of Mesopotamia, once the inventors of writing, forgot how to read the very script they had created. Cultural blending defined this era. Persian art, architecture, and religion influenced Mesopotamian traditions, and the old gods began to lose their place in daily life. The worship of Marduk, Ishtar, and Enlil continued in name, but the temples grew quieter, their priests fewer. Many of the grand ziggurats fell into ruin, their bricks reused to build new cities under foreign empires. Still, the essence of Mesopotamian culture lived on, transformed but not destroyed. The Persians admired the region's knowledge, adopting many of its administrative systems and scientific achievements. Babylon remained a center of learning and astronomy, and Persian kings relied on Mesopotamian scholars to track the movements of the stars and planets. When Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire in 331 BCE, he entered Babylon as Cyrus had, with respect. He admired the city's beauty and envisioned making it the capital of his own vast empire. He ordered repairs to the city's temples and palaces, hoping to restore Babylon to its former glory. But Alexander's sudden death only 2 years later ended those dreams. In the centuries that followed, Greek Hellenistic influence spread across Mesopotamia. Greek became the language of trade and administration, and many Mesopotamians adopted elements of Greek culture. The old temples became museums of memory, respected but no longer alive. Babylon, once the gate of the gods, became a symbol of the past. As time passed, new empires came and went. The Seleucids, Parthians, and later the Romans. Each left its mark, but none revived the old ways. The names of the ancient gods faded, their stories forgotten except in fragments of clay buried beneath the sand. And yet, the legacy of Mesopotamia refused to die. Its influence stretched far beyond its borders, carried into the cultures that followed. The Persians inherited its systems of law and record-keeping. The Greeks and Romans learned from its science, mathematics, and astronomy. The very concept of organized cities, written laws, and structured government, all born in Mesopotamia, became the foundation of later civilizations. Its religious ideas also echoed through time. The Mesopotamian story of a great flood, first told in the Epic of Gilgamesh, found new life in the biblical story of Noah. The tale of a paradise garden, a serpent, and a fall from grace mirrored ancient Sumerian myths. Even the image of a divine tower reaching the heavens, remembered in the Tower of Babel, was inspired by Babylon's. When the ancient faiths faded, their spirit lived on in new religions, in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The idea of a single, all-powerful God ruling the heavens may have evolved from Mesopotamian notions of divine kingship and cosmic order. The heavens that Babylonian astronomers mapped so carefully became the same stars studied by later scholars of all faiths. By the 1st century CE, Mesopotamia's great cities had become ruins. The Tigris and Euphrates still flowed, but the voices that once prayed, built, and dreamed along their banks were silent. The land became a frontier, conquered by empires, settled by new peoples, and shaped by new faiths. For nearly 2,000 years, Mesopotamia's story lay hidden beneath the earth. Then, in the 19th century, archaeologists rediscovered its ruins, the cities of Uruk, Nineveh, and Babylon, and unearthed clay tablets that told of kings, gods, and everyday life. When cuneiform was finally deciphered, the world rediscovered the voices of its first storytellers. Though its empires fell, Mesopotamia's ideas never truly disappeared. Its legacy lives in every law code, every written word, every city built with order and design. The dream that began between the Tigris and Euphrates, to understand the world, to govern it, to record it, continues today. Mesopotamia may have lost its independence, but its influence became eternal. It was not only the birthplace of civilization, it was its teacher. Every empire that followed Persian, Greek, Roman, and beyond carried a piece of its wisdom forward. The land between two rivers gave humanity its first light. And though the rivers still run quietly through the deserts of modern Iraq, the echoes of Mesopotamia still flow through time itself, through every language we speak, every law we follow, and every dream of progress that humanity dares to imagine. As the great cities of Mesopotamia, Uruk, Babylon, and Nineveh, fell silent, their spirit lived on. Though their temples crumbled and their kings faded into legend, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates had already changed the world forever. It was here, thousands of years ago, that humanity first learned how to build, organize, and dream. Mesopotamia's greatest gift to history was the idea of civilization itself. It gave birth to writing, law, government, architecture, mathematics, and literature, the tools that shaped every society that followed. Every nation, every modern city, every piece of writing carries a trace of what began here. The invention of writing, through cuneiform, was perhaps the most important step. What started as simple marks on clay to count grain soon became a way to record thoughts, prayers, and stories. For the first time, knowledge could outlive a single generation. It could be passed down, shared, and remembered. Today, every book, every law, and every message we write owes something to those first clay tablets pressed in ancient Sumer. The laws of Hammurabi introduced fairness and structure to society, an early vision of justice. His code taught that the rule of law should stand above the will of rulers. That idea still guides us today, thousands of years later. In science and mathematics, Mesopotamian scholars were pioneers. They developed the concept of the 60-minute hour, the 24-hour day, and divided circles into 360-degree systems we still use without thinking about their ancient origins. They studied the stars and charted their movements, creating calendars that guided harvests and religious festivals. These early astronomers laid the foundation for everything from navigation to modern astronomy. Their cities were the first of their kind, built with precision and purpose. They had temples, marketplaces, schools, and homes, the blueprint of every modern city. The ziggurats, rising above the plains, inspired later architecture across the ancient world. And then there were the stories, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the flood myths, the legends of gods and heroes. These tales explored what it means to be human, to love, to lose, to fear death, and to search for meaning. They were the world's first literature and continue to echo in the stories we tell today. Even religion, philosophy, and morality owe much to Mesopotamia. The ideas of divine justice, paradise, and a great flood found in later religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, trace their origins back to Sumerian and Babylonian myths. Though their languages disappeared and their temples turned to dust, Mesopotamia's legacy never died. It flowed quietly into every civilization that came after, through the Persians, Greeks, Romans, and even into our modern world. Today, when we look at the ruins of Babylon or the remains of Ur, we are not just seeing the past, we are seeing the birthplace of human imagination, the first light of knowledge that still shines today. Final outro. Personal message best picture channel. And that brings us to the end of our journey through ancient Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization. When I started creating this series, I wanted to do more than just tell stories from the past. I wanted to bring them to life, to remind all of us where we came from. Because the people who lived thousands of years ago, along the Tigris and Euphrates, were not so different from us. They dreamed, they built, they loved, and they searched for meaning, just like we do today. Their legacy still lives in every corner of our world, in our words, our cities, our laws, and our ideas. That's why I believe history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding who we are now. If you enjoyed this journey through time, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to my channel Past Picture, and share it with your friends who love history. It helps this community grow and keeps the past alive for new generations. As the video ends, you'll see a few behind-the-scenes moments and past clips from the channel, a small tribute to the amazing support you've given so far. Every view, every comment, every like keeps this passion for history burning. Thank you for watching, for learning, and for keeping history alive. And you've even watching, where we bring the forgotten stories of our world back to life. Until next time, stay curious, stay inspired, and never stop exploring the past. Because every picture from history tells a story worth remembering.